Voila, we're starting. So, guess I ought to get where there's a PowerPoint so you can see it. So this is where I've been doing this presentation forever with regard to the heart. Let me just get where we're going with this. Probably that's as good an illustration to use as possible. Effectively, when you're doing cardiac anatomy, we end up with police work, well, more or less. Take it. Effectively, it's 4 chambers, certainly not drawn at all to scale. That's what it works. So we'll look at it this way because effectively that's kind of how it started. You have 2 smaller chambers that are the atria, and you have 2 larger chambers that are the ventricles. These are the muscular chambers that pump. There's relatively scant musculature there, just enough, effectively, as I told you before, to sort of top off the tank. So what do we have? So what you're going to see, and you'll see this when you look at the dissection on Monday in the laboratory, effectively, the exit point for the ventricles is in top of the heart. But if you want to think of it originally, it probably started like this, where the atria were here and the ventricles were down here, and the exit points, which I always draw down here anyway, coming from the right and the left, were down here. But what happened over time as the heart developed, there's so much more muscularity, and much more so on the left than the right, that those exits, the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, like any muscle, it contracted and contracted and contracted. And the strongest muscle contracted the most, so it kind of came out like this. And that's really the orientation. You want to think of it this way. On the anterior aspect of the heart, when you see it with the cow heart, this is the pulmonary trunk. And that we always use the term trunk because we know it's going to split into respectively, the left and right pulmonary arteries. The one that is slightly more posterior to it, of the vessels that exit the ventricles, is the aorta, and this indeed is the aortic arch. So that's kind of where you start to get that orientation. So the overdevelopment is to the left, but because the exit points, rather than being down here over time, as this heart beat and beat and beat throughout gestation and finally at birth, now the orientation is certainly left and lower, but now the vessels, the exiting vessels, have kind of come up this way. You get the left overpowering. That's my view. And that works for me. Whether it works for you or not, I don't know. So let's look at the chambers. We have a right atrium, I'll just use the abbreviations, a left atrium, and they're not, again, drawn to scale, a right ventricle, and a left ventricle. They have to pump equally and work simultaneously. They have to have an equal amount being pumped out to the body, an equal amount going to the lungs, and we have to ensure more than anything else one-way flow. Like, you can't back up. Ultimately, and I say this all the time, it's a plumbing problem. It backs up and creates problems. The left side of the heart backs up, it goes into the lungs, and there's a bunch of fluid, pulmonary edema. If the right side backs up, it becomes peripheral edema. First the abdomen, and then gravity will take it down to the lower extremities. So in order to ensure that, we have, very importantly, valves in between the atria and the ventricles. And we have valves also here at the exit points for the pulmonary arteries and the aorta. And I'll name all of these shortly. So that's the first, to ensure that the flow goes, this basically traveling to the lungs and then making its way back and then out to the rest of the body is kind of how it goes. What happens after this is we start to look at what the entry points. So we'll start with the blood coming from the lungs over here. So from the lungs, now by this time the blood has been reoxygenated, and I beg your pardon, rephrase that. The lungs are going to be over there. So coming from the body, rather, this blood will be deoxygenated. It'll be more cumbersome to start on the other side. Deoxygenated blood. And it's got 3 entry points. It has an entry point, and you'll notice that this is an area where we don't see valves, which customarily see valves and veins, but the blood is flowing back in sufficient volume and sufficiently rapidly so it doesn't require we want the blood to flow in and flow in pieces. So there's 3 entry points. 2 are very obvious and very famous. The one up here is called the superior vena cava, or cavernous vein, giant vein. Draining, and that's the term we use for veins, the head and the neck and the upper extremities. All that blood is coming back by that passage. Everything else, the torso and the lower extremities, everything else enters by way of this. And this is the widest of all the blood vessels, the inferior vena cava. I just put IVC. And that all the rest, the torso, the lower extremities, everything comes back here. It's the widest if you measure it by a diameter of all the blood vessels. Yet there's one other. There's a tiny entry point in the back. And that's where we see the blood that is the heart is using to beat is returned to be reoxygenated. The heart is a very selfish organ. It feeds itself first. The coronary arteries are the very first pair of vessels that are given off by the aorta. They're given off shortly after it exits. So if this is the exit point of the aorta, which it is, not drawn by the diagram, we're looking at it on the diagram. These are the valves that are here. Those are the aortic, they're called semilunar valves. It says aortic valve. Right after that, at the start of the aorta, there's 2 little openings. And sometimes you can see on the dissection, and those are the openings for the right and left coronary arteries. Coronary arteries are kind of the oddballs in the sense that we don't normally the veins are named for the artery. So, but we don't have coronary arteries. We have coronary arteries. We don't have coronary veins. We have cardiac veins. And all those veins, as you will see shortly, collect on the posterior aspect of the heart. And what they form is a collecting area. When a vein has a large flattened area where it collects fluid, it's called a sinus. And this is called, very famously, on the back of the heart, posterior aspect, the coronary sinus, the blood. So those are the 3 entry points. Superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, coronary sinus. And understand, when the heart is at rest, these valves are open, these valves are closed. So what that means is it's passively filling the ventricles. Blood's just coming in. Okay? So we assure one-way flow. We do this by a series of valves. The first set of valves were named because they looked to anatomists like a tooth. So you have your teeth have different names for different shapes. I don't do teeth. Plants, I don't do physics, I don't do teeth. So, but this particular tooth is famous for those of you who are into teeth, called a tricuspid valve because it looked like the top of a tricuspid tooth. There are 3 little cusps. What was interesting about that is they created a seal. And valves are funny, and I'll show it to you over here. This is a very good depiction of a valve. They're not flat flaps. They're cup-like. So here would be an opening. Here would be the chambers themselves, let's say. The valves kind of look like this. They're cup-shaped. And when the pressure would build up, it will push the valves closed. So they kind of start to look like that when closed. So these little cups are open because the blood's flowing down with gravity. And when the pressure builds up in the ventricle, as the heart gets ready to take the next beat, they close. It's very noisy. The closure of the tricuspid valves and the valves on the other side, which are interestingly bicuspid valves, create the first heart sound, which is the loudest of the sound. So it's a very noisy closure. Valves are interesting because they don't always behave themselves. Valves sometimes are too stiff and narrow. And if they're too stiff and narrow, it's kind of like when they close, when they open or close, it's very hard for them to fill. The name we give to that is stenosis. You can have stenotic valves, okay? And sometimes your valves are just faulty. They just don't close well. So it would just indicate that the valve has an irregularity or a fault. But the worst of all the problems is when the valves close, and you can just start to see them over here. These are called chordotendony or tendinous cords. A because they came from heart muscle, and anatomists call these papillary muscles. I don't know why. But muscles beat the tendons, they look like little guitar strings when you see them inside the heart, and they attach to the valves, and they restrict those valves from going the wrong way. So the valves, they're like this. And they're attached to these papillary muscles here against the wall, so to speak. So when they close, they prevent the valves from basically doing this, flapping back the wrong way, just like your umbrella on that windy day. And it's never a good thing. Take it from a golfer when it's windy and rainy. Oh. Now, it has a very famous name. It's called a prolapse valve, and that's the worst. When it prolapses, it flaps the other way. So you have stenosis. You can have valves that are stiff. You can have valves that are irregular. And the funny thing about all of that is whatever occasions them not to close properly or inadequately or too stiffly, whatever it might be, it creates a sound, and that's what heart murmurs are. Irregularities in the valves, even irregularities on the valves, create a certain amount of turbulence. And turbulence is bad for a variety of reasons. Number one, when it's turbulent, it makes clots. Clots are bad. When valves that are damaged long term, and this is what used to be a very, very common problem associated with streptococcal infections called rheumatic fever. That was one of the principal causes for valvular defects. Those clots would sometimes lay on the valves, and the valves, that blood would become a media, just like you used when you were in micro. Didn't you use something called blood agar? That's blood agar. Dried or blood gelled on those valves would be a media. And what do we usually grow on blood agar? Very fastidious bacteria, particularly streptococcus. And we get streptococcus transiently in us when we go get our teeth cleaned and scaled, or we have a dental extraction. So a lot of people had to use antibiotics preventatively if they had heart murmurs secondary to valvular defects when they were going, let's say, twice a year to get their teeth cleaned and scaled, because you get what's called a transient bacteria. See, learn something new every day. I'm in a good mood because you brought Chelsea.
Oh, you're welcome. We'll bring her every day.
You should.
Okay.
She's a positive source, unlike me being so negative all the time.
Well, live with her. You'll think otherwise.
No, I can't do that. My wife would object.
Well, Stein, you don't have to take everything so literally.
You said live with her.
Yeah, but
What did I tell my wife what you said?
why would you do that? You're stupid for doing that. Don't tell your wife that.
Here you go. Trouble. You're in trouble. Oh. Moving on. Moving on. So we have that. Now on the other side, same deal, same tendinous cords. This valve is called the bicuspid valve because it has two cusps rather than three, or two leaflets. Okay. It also has a different name that you'll very often refer to it as, called the mitral valve. Because it resembles to anatomists a miter. I always ask this. I've been asking this question for 20 years. What's a miter? It's not a joke. What's a miter with you? I'm fine. What's a miter? Okay. What's a miter? You play, have you played chess? Go ahead and look it up.
How do you spell it?
M-I-T-R-E.
Ari.
Look on a chessboard.
See, well, I do play chess, but I don't know what the there is.
One of the chess pieces has a miter on his head.
The bishop?
The bishop. The badge of office of a bishop,
Little groove.
right, is the cap. That the bishop has two badges of office: a staff and the cap. So the cap, it kind of points up like this, and it's got those straps that go around the back. Okay, it's like you went to Burger King and you got the. You learn something new every day. That's the bad. The Pope has one because he's the Bishop of Rome. I'm just a Jewish kid, know all about it. That's the back of your mind. I've always had a fascination with this stuff. A wonderful book by a guy named Henry Morton Robinson back in the 50s, made into a pretty good movie called The Cardinal. It was sort of a takeoff, like a fictionalization of the very famous cardinal in Boston, who was sort of the advisor to the Kennedy clan. Wonderful book. My mom and I went to see that movie. 1963. Tom Tryon, 1960. He was a cowboy star in Disney. Just saying. Moving on. Also a very good writer of fiction, mystery fiction. So now you have right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. You have the passageway. So they assure blood flow. Well, on the right side of the heart, the blood is deoxygenated. So we'll use blue. On the left side of the heart, after it's gone from the lungs, now it's made its way back from the lungs. And when you have arteries, you typically have twice as many veins. So in the heart, with the pulmonary trunk, the single vessel that leaves the right ventricle, it bifurcates, splits, one going to the left lung, one going to the right lung. So there's two pulmonary veins, and they come back typically as two pulmonary arteries, but they come back as double, 4 pulmonary veins. And notice the color now is oxygenated blood. The unique feature of these two systems is other than in the adult, other than in the fetus. In the fetus, the umbilical artery and the umbilical vein are reversed because the mom is breathing for the baby. The lungs are non-functional. So the umbilical veins have oxygenated blood, so the umbilical arteries have deoxygenated blood. In us, the only arteries that have deoxygenated blood, pulmonary. And the only ones that have oxygen, the only veins with oxygenated blood are the pulmonary veins. So they're unique. They're exceptions to the rule. The mistake that people make is they think arteries have oxygenated blood and veins do not. The reality is arteries take blood away from the heart. Veins bring blood back to the heart. So that's the definition rather than the other way around. And then when we get to the valves that are here, each of these valves have 3 leaflets. They look a little bit like half or quarter moons, so they're called semilunar valves. And so this one, because it's pulmonary, is the pulmonic semilunar or pulmonic valve. And this, because it's the aorta, is the aortic valve. And a lot of times I'll just insert the word semilunar. Now that's interesting that those valves are closed, but when the heart beats, it generates enough pressure to push open. So the valves are like this, it pushes them open. The blood flows, but as soon as the heart starts to relax, understand, and you'll learn about this too, that these big vessels are called elastic arteries, which means they're like a trampoline, they rebound. So the force opens them up, it's like jumping on the trampoline, but when the force is released, there's the bounce back that occurs. And with that bounce back, it's kind of like this. Imagine you have a straw with liquid in it, okay? So the straw is filled with liquid and you squeeze it in the middle. Well, you're going to push fluid in both directions. That bounce back is going to help the fluid flow, let's say, to the body or to the lungs. But the bounce back is also going to push the fluid back against the valves, okay? And so what it's going to do against the aortic and pulmonic valves, it's going to close them. And again, somewhat noisily. And that's the second heart sound. And those stay closed as the heart rests, they stay closed, and gravity allows the blood to push open because the pressure is gone from in the ventricles to basically allow the heart to refill when the heart in between beats. And you'll see when we get down to it in the physiology part of the program, the heart beats takes about a quarter of a second for a typical heartbeat, and then the heart rests for about 3/4 of a second, sometimes a little bit less. Okay. Most of us, our heart beats more rapidly than once a day, once a second, I beg your pardon, for every second of our lifetime. But So there's maybe a quarter of a second when it's active and at least a half a second or more when it's at rest. And the more rest it has, the better. Okay. That's the whole idea. We want the heart to have, because that is your cardiac reserve. And that's a really important thing. It allows you in times of stress, in times when you have to have extra circulation provided. Additionally, there's a couple of other anatomical structures. They don't depict them here, but you saw a little bit before, and as I go through the slides, you'll see them. Here, we have expansion chambers that look like little ears. You'll see them easily on the cow hearts. They're called auricles because they look like ears. And when they fold, when they're empty, they sort of accordion pleat, and we call those pectinate muscles. It's just folds of the musculature of that expansion chamber. There's one on the right and one on the left. And again, these, you'll be impressed by how little these are rather than how large they are. Additionally, the heart, both chambers, even though it's going to appear much smaller on the right, have a lot of depth. There's a lot of little nooks and crannies that provide volume. They reminded anatomists of the trabecular pattern of bones, so they call them trabeculi carneate, the trabecular pattern of the muscles, or the meat, carneate, of the heart. So papillary muscles attaching only to the atrioventricular valves by way of chorda tendinae to limit the potential for the valves to prolapse. We have, again, you'll see the aortic valve here, the pulmonic valve here, you'll be able to see. So those, and obviously here you have the tricuspid and the bicuspid or mitral. And that's really the lay of the land when it comes to the heart. And I like it because I could do it in color. You know, red and blue, love that. Because that's what the diagram looks like. Isn't that special? So, other features. The chambers are divided and we call them sulci, just like we do in the brain. So the coronary sulcus is the groove, and again, you'll see that demonstrated that's between the atria and the ventricles. Those sulci, including the one in the front, the anterior interventricular sulcus, and the one in the back, the posterior interventricular sulcus, are the passageways for the coronary arteries and the cardiac veins. Okay, in general, veins will always be closer to the surface than the artery, and then if there's nerves, they'll be underneath them. So when you look at that cow's heart, if you see a vessel, a darkened area that looks kind of brownish and it looks like fluid, you can almost push with your finger, that's a vein. Same thing, you might have seen that on the sheep brain. Those are veins. Because the arteries basically don't. When we look at the vessels, what happens with veins is they flatten out. They're very hard to find. But the arteries, because of the elasticity, and particularly the pulmonary artery or pulmonary trunk and the aorta, are a little easier to identify. They hold their shape. They're not perfectly round, but they're certainly, you can tell that there is an opening there. And I'll show you how you identify where it is. I have a pretty good video for that. With the sheep heart, we just have to sort of transfer it to the cow heart. So those are really important because you'll need to know the four major coronary vessels. So the right and left coronary arteries, the main trunk of them, travel by way of the coronary sulcus. The anterior interventricular sulcus has what's called the anterior interventricular artery. Years ago, we used to call it, because it went down, and it was mostly servicing the left side of the heart and the left ventricle. It was famously called the left anterior descending. So that's a name that we used to use years ago. That was also known as the widowmaker, because that was typically when someone got a heart attack there, it meant the ventricles didn't work, the blood couldn't pump, and they succumbed to the heart attack. At least now, we'll do more of this when we get into the physiology part of the program. At least now we have a fair amount of understanding and ability to look at the heart with imaging, and with scans and with ultrasound. When you have valve problems, you do it with ultrasound. You do something called sonography. So there's a lot of technology that's available. Years ago, I had one. I'm going to tell you, it's about, I think it was '04. I think it was '04. Last time I had one, they did a thing called a thallium scan, where first I had to get on the treadmill, and at that time having started to use the gym, I mean, they were frustrated because, aren't you feeling tired with this? I said, no, I do the treadmill all the time. It's like, oh, really? So all of a sudden, what they're trying to do is they want to crank it up to make it hard for you to do, and then to initiate either an arrhythmia or some irregularity. So they're trying to give an idea, like a read on how much it takes for you to get damaged, and then subsequently, then they inject you with this radioactive stuff and put you in a scanner, and they're able to then scan the vessels to see if there's any damage. I haven't had to have one of those done in quite a long time. They don't do them as much anymore. Okay, they take it's probably more insurance oriented because it's less costly to do those things. So they used to call that a stress test, because they would put you, try to stress you with that. The posterior interventricular sulcus has the posterior interventricular artery, which is also large, that services the back of the heart. So this is the view that we see a lot. These are the auricles that you can see here. It's hard to see. When I do this, do you see the cursor? Maybe a little bit? No? Yeah. That's sort of the pitfall here. I can't get the cursor to show up with this. But you can see those areas with the reddish color directly above the ventricles. Those are used to represent the auricles. They have a distinctly different color and appearance. You can see the arteries that are there. There's a modest amount of fat. When we look at the back of the heart, now that's typically, it's easier if you're able to find the inferior vena cava there. You can see the 4 pulmonary veins. These are the cardiac veins. They're the blood from the coronary arteries, albeit with a different name. The only other vessels that are different like that, you have going to your brain, you have carotid arteries. Coming back, you have jugular veins. Other than that, they're the same. Radial artery, radial vein. Femoral artery, femoral vein. Iliac artery, iliac. So you can begin to see the structures that are there. So here you can see the relatively large posterior interventricular artery. In general, you see more of the right ventricle on the anterior aspect of the heart, but the reality is that anterior interventricular artery plays a really pivotal role in the left ventricle because it's got 3 to 4 times as much musculature as you will see. So this is another illustration we do the practical that you'll see. And with regard to the practicals, the answer is not yet. I didn't start them. There's too much aggravation going on in my family right now. Don't have children. For those of you who already have children, don't have any more children. Anybody want to adopt a 39-year-old? I know. It's the greatest thing what Haley said. She goes, I said, what about boys? She goes, they're accessories. Tell my wife about that. I love that. I think my middle one is an accessory. The atria, relatively small. The walls are very thin. There's very little musculature. The auricles, again, allow for increases in volume. Again, and this is just the way it is. We see pectinate muscles. I see them in both. It's a little hard. Again, the vena cava, the coronary sinus, the 3 things that drain in. The left atrium, typically there's 4 pulmonary veins. It's hard to tell they're not so easy to find in the specimens that we look at, be it a sheep heart or a cow heart. But the pectinate muscles are typically only in the auricles that you can see. They're easier to see in the auricles. And again, we use this illustration all the time. The ventricles, the discharge chamber. On the anterior, we see the anterior aspect of the right ventricle, but the mass is really much more left ventricle that's there, I think. And again, the trabeculae carneae, those are regular ridges on the ventricular walls. The papillary muscles, these outpouchings that have the chorda tendinae, they're very straightforward. The thickness is certainly there and the direction of blood flow. And then there's a variety of illustrations in this that are not that relevant for our purposes. I mean, if these give you some definition, looking at some of these and seeing the little ridges because pectinate means little finger-like muscles, okay, or the left and you'll see the distinction between the left and right ventricle, the opening for the coronary sinus. Maybe you'll be able to find some of those things. So, but that's a really, obviously for illustrations, they use really good specimens. This is the aortic arch. So the aorta comes up, arches, and goes back down behind the heart, where it's called the descending or thoracic aorta. Then it pierces the diaphragm, and now it famously is called the abdominal aorta. It's all the same vessel. It's about location. There are 3 vessels that come off when we get to really the next anatomical unit that we will do. And we'll probably get into some of that on Monday, I anticipate, will be the blood vessels. And so we'll be able to identify that this is called the brachiocephalic trunk. This is the left common carotid. This is the left subclavian. So you'll begin to learn about the names of all the blood vessels. That's next on the program that are there. And again, you're seeing basically the same thing that you would see. And they have a variety of these. The unidirectional nature, again, the atrioventricular and semilunar valves, which are the exit points, of course. Inertia really plays most of it. So what you're going to see that really where we see the concentration of valves in veins is typically in extremities, more so than anywhere else. Okay. And veins, you'll see that the blood flow, the return of blood has to do a lot with one, the initial pressure that the blood is being ejected at. So it gets all the way down, say all the way down to your feet, and it still has some pressure left to start to work its way up, but that's not enough pressure to get up to your heart. So then we have to rely on the valves, and basically the valves ensure something called segmental flow. So as the fluid goes up, when gravity tries to take over and push the fluid down, then the valves shut. So it keeps sort of working its way up. It's assisted tremendously by muscle activity. Breathing, muscle activity are really what allow blood to flow back. So what you'll see if someone is in a hospital bed for a long, it's what we used to do. Someone would have a major surgery, they'd be in bed for a week, okay, and they would frown on them moving around. The reality was they had 2 big problems: pneumonia and blood clots. The reason was the blood was pooling. We call it stasis. So they developed a couple of techniques. What we used to do when we had a 90-year-old person we did hip surgery on, they were sitting up in a chair that night. They were down in physical therapy learning how to walk with a walker the next day. So we learned early on not to do that. What happened to me when I had to be in bed when I had major surgery on 2 occasions, and maybe you've seen them if you're in a hospital working, they have what are called intermittent compression devices. You put elastic hose called TED hose, which stands for thromboembolic disease. And they typically go roughly from your feet all the way up to like mid-thigh. And they put devices on both of your leg and calf area. And they set them with a machine and they squeeze intermittently. So 20-second squeeze, then they release. 20-second squeeze, and they release. You can set them to alternate. You can set them slower. You can set them faster. And they're designed to keep the blood flowing. Typically, the pooling occurs in the calf. And I'll show you where that happens as well. Fair word of warning for the limited number of you who are awake and not Zach, he's sleeping. And it's okay, he had a rough night. Thirsty Thursday strikes again. Yeah, sure. Where were you drinking? You're an athlete. You're not supposed to be out there, and you're not supposed to be out there hitting it, Yeah, you had that long meeting with John Barleycorn. That was an old name for whiskey, John Barleycorn. Very good song by a group called Traffic. John Barleycorn Must Die. That was an album. So 4, 7, 11 people. Well, we barely have a quorum. I demand a recount. I know you're here. I know you're fine. We can excuse you. Moving on. So fair warning. Veins are not only veins are an area of interest where I did a lot of research. So whenever you have a professor who studied that stuff, you typically find more questions. Be afraid. Be very afraid. So they're just showing you pictures of the valves, the names of the valves, chorda tendinae, a whole lot of illustrations, and all these neat colored images about where the blood's going. So, I mean, I can't tell you how many thousands of times I've done this already. Too many. But that's a really good view of what a valve's like. Okay? They're cup-like. They're not flaps. They're cups more than anything else. Interestingly, a physics professor of your acquaintance, he does research in these. So Dr. Buxton would do computer modeling of valve flow and had some students doing research with that. So it's really an area of interest of his as well as of mine. So when valves allow backflow and the part has to repump the blood, the generic term is incompetent. When they're narrow, it's much more specific with stenosis or when it's prolapse. So other than that, their incompetency is sort of more of a generic term. What they used to do a lot was to do valvular replacements. They now do what are called valvuloplasties. They'll go in and remodel the valve to try to eliminate the problem. The reason why they don't want to do replacements is if you do a valvular replacement, then that individual is going to be on blood thinners for the rest of their life. And I mean, so now you're dealing with an issue with a long-term medicine that can have problems with regard to bleeding. So they favor that. My nephew's first wife, when he is an attorney, and they were in the DC area, a brilliant girl. I mean, they discovered an insurance physical that she had a really bad valve, and they did the valvuloplasty. She was working for a big law firm and had this done, and it was just they were fortunate to be able to do that. So, very brilliant, but very different, very different. Number 1 from Georgetown Law School. That's pretty darn smart. So, and you can read through this as easily as I can read it to you. So the whole idea, equal volumes to each circuit, the pulmonary circuit, because of the muscularity of the heart, is relatively short as compared to going throughout the whole body and very low pressure, where the systemic circuit is long and it travels at a lot of pressure. So the left ventricular walls, and why they're so easy to tell left from right, is they're 3, maybe even 4 times thicker. The ejection pressure from the right ventricle is about 25 millimeters of mercury. And and normally, the whole 120 over 80 is about 120 from the left side. And so it's a good cutaway that you can kind of see the volumes, even though they don't look the same, are the same. Because you have to sort of push against those to really determine the whole volume. The volume isn't that great. The volume in your ventricles is about 4 ounces, about 120 milliliters. It's not a ton. And we eject, I might have told you, only about 70 of those 120 each beat. That's roughly 57% what we call the ejection fraction. That may seem inefficient to you, but comparatively, it's very efficient. The coronary circulation, shortest one in the body. When your heart is beating, in between beats is when it supplies itself. When it contracts, it squeezes those vessels. They're not strong enough to overwhelm or to fight against that muscular contraction. And obviously the left ventricle with most musculature receives the most of it. So the right and left coronary arteries arrive immediately after the aortic semilunar valves. They encircle the heart in that coronary sulcus. There's a lot of variation. There's formations you will see shortly. And the reason that it's so intricate is there's a lot of passageways if something becomes transiently or even permanently either totally or partially blocked. They have a great name. You're going to see a lot of it. It's called an anastomosis. Anastomosis literally translates to another mouth. And so, for instance, when we would do bowel surgery, or if you would do coronary artery bypass surgery, the terminology was, so if you took out a piece of bowel that had cancer and you stuck the ends back together, it was called anastomosing. Same thing if you put bypass surgery and you're trying to bypass a clot in one of the coronary arteries. You would anastomose. That was the terminology. The anastomoses are the beauty of the heart that allows, if one passageway is blocked, if blood can't get to the back of the heart by one way, it can go another way, or the front another way. And so that's why we don't do as much heart surgery as we used to. We found out now that there are ways that you can, and that's really what exercise does. And particularly when you talk about cardio, why that's so valuable, it increases the amount of anastomoses. And so that's, I don't go to the gym often enough. My wife will tell you that immediately, daily. Again, round is a shape. I keep telling her, she just doesn't buy it. Even this morning, she was criticizing my girth. Yes, body shaming me. It's horrible. I mean, that's body shaming and elderly abuse. Surprised she's not appearing on social media someplace. So she indicated that I should get rid of this large frontal area, or at least reduce it. Though she didn't use terminology that was quite so non-specific. It's like most times she tells me I should take my corpulent mule to the gym. Fat ass. Corpulent mule. Rotund donkey. It's language. It's your friend. So the heart consistently gets about 5% of your blood supply, very consistently, unless you're very, very active. So these are the branches you need to know. The left gives off, most famously and the largest, is the anterior interventricular artery. It then gives off a branch that circumflexes. Circumflex means it goes around to the back. The right will continue around and join that circumflexing branch. And what it will also give off on the back of the heart is the posterior interventricular artery that will eventually anastomose with the anterior artery. And you'll see that here. So here you have the vessels being given off the left anterior interventricular. You can see up here. Here's the left coronary. You go right off of the aorta. Circumflex going around the back, and the anterior interventricular on the right coronary artery. You have the right artery continuing all the way around and joining up again. Here you can see anastomoses, and this is called the marginal artery that goes down, this outer marginal artery. So those are the four that you need to know. There's about 9 like medical school anatomy names, but these 4 will do for now. Okay? And then you have the cardiac, you have the coronary veins that are basically cardiac veins, is the true name for them. And I don't care about them. They have anastomoses as well, as you will see. They all eventually empty here into the coronary sinus. And now you saw that illustration before. And the very last slide, when you hear chest pain, the fancy name is angina pectoris. It indicates that there is a relative and even an absolute lack of blood, and the cells, quote unquote, are not giving enough oxygen, so they're weakened. And the response is pain. When you hear the term infarction, it's very specific. Death of tissue from lack of blood supply. It could be a total blockage or a partial blockage, but it means cells have died. When cardiac cells die, they don't get better. Okay? They're repaired with non-contractile scar tissue. Whether that damage is long-term or not, whether that impacts you dramatically or not, depends on the severity of it. It can cause death immediately, or it can cause very limited activities, or it can be comparatively speaking silent. A lot of people end up looking at an electrocardiogram, and the doctor will take a look at it and go, it looks like you had a heart attack some time ago. And it surprises people because they may dismiss it with indigestion or tightness in the chest, or I had a little chest pain, my arm hurt, and they didn't pay any attention to it. That could be a problem. And on that less than pleasant note, I will say adieu. Goodbye.